On Thursday, September 14th, in the year 591, a man stood in a room in Rome and made a decision. It was not a new law, it was not a declaration of war, it was just a sermon. But that single sermon created a fabricated story that would hold absolute, unquestioned authority for the next 1,378 years. And the effects of that single narrative did not stay in the 6th century. They traveled through time, they crossed oceans, they embedded themselves into the foundation of every major Christian denomination, and they eventually found their way into your childhood, your church, and your own body. If you grew up in the church, you know the name Mary Magdalene. You know the exact story you were told about her. You know what she represented. But you do not know what actually happened in that room in Rome, and you do not know the exact mechanism they used to erase the most prominent female leader in early Christianity and replace her with a warning label. And the data shows exactly why this matters right now. 70% of women who leave evangelical or conservative churches cite the unequal treatment of women and the policing of women's bodies as a primary reason. That is not an opinion. That is documented by sociological research across multiple demographics. Millions of women have spent their entire lives carrying a profound sense of spiritual inferiority, believing that their highest possible calling was silent submission, and that any deviation from absolute purity made them damaged goods. The Barna Group and other research institutes have tracked this exodus for decades, and the justification for that culture of shame almost always traces back to the same biblical models. But here is the part that breaks the math completely. The foundation of that purity culture, the ultimate example of the fallen woman who had to be humbled and silenced, the story that was used to tell generations of women exactly what their place was entirely manufactured. The text itself never said it. One man invented it, and the institution protected it because it was the most effective control mechanism they could possibly design. And when the math does not add up, people start to walk away. In this video, I am going to show you exactly what happened in the year 591. I am going to show you the precise mechanism of how they merged three completely separate women into one fabricated character to strip away her authority. We are going to look at what the canonical texts actually say about her. Not the hidden Gospels, not the Gnostic texts, but the Bible sitting on your shelf right now. And at the end, I am going to show you the quiet, hidden footnote where the Vatican finally admitted the truth 1,378 years later, and what you need to do with that information today. They did not erase her name. They just changed who she was, because a repentant sinner is much easier to control than an independent female leader. To understand where this came from, we have to start with what was actually there before it was changed. If you grew up in the church, you were taught that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute who was saved by Jesus, who wept at his feet, and who became the ultimate symbol of sexual repentance. That is the story. It is deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness. It is in the movies, it is in the paintings, it is in the sermons. But if you actually open the canonical Gospels, the texts that the Church itself declares as the absolute truth, that story simply does not exist. Nowhere in the New Testament is Mary Magdalene ever identified as a prostitute. Nowhere is she identified as a sex worker. Nowhere is her name attached to sexual sin of any kind. This is not a liberal reinterpretation of the text. This is simply what the text says. What the Gospel of Luke, specifically Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, actually says is that Mary Magdalene was a woman of means. She is named alongside Joanna and Susanna as women who provided for Jesus' ministry out of their own resources. She was a financial patron. She was a woman of independent wealth and influence who funded the movement. In the ancient world, being a patron meant holding authority. It meant you had a seat at the table. It meant you were not a passive observer. You were an active stakeholder in the mission. You were the one making the logistics possible. And her prominence does not stop there. In all four Gospels, she is the one constant presence at the crucifixion when the male disciples flee in terror. She stands there, watching the execution, refusing to abandon the movement. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, She is the primary first witness to the resurrection. Jesus appears to her first, before Peter, before John, before anyone else. And he explicitly commands her to go and tell the male disciples what has happened. She is the one who delivers the most important message in the history of the Christian faith. In early Christianity, this earned her the title Apostolorum Apostola, the apostle to the apostles. She was not a silent follower. She was the foundational witness upon which the entire claim of the resurrection rested. And here is where you might be asking a very logical question. If that is what the text actually says, if she was a wealthy patron and the primary apostle, how on earth did she become known as a repentant prostitute? The answer to that question reveals exactly how institutions control narratives. You have to understand the threat that an independent, wealthy, authoritative woman posed to a developing patriarchal institution. In the first few centuries of Christianity, women held significant leadership roles. They hosted house churches in their large villas, they prophesied, they taught, and they funded the movement. They were essential to the survival and expansion of the early church. But as the church began to institutionalize, as it moved from a persecuted grassroots movement into the halls of Roman power, it adopted the structures of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was strictly, legally patriarchal. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held absolute power. Men held the public authority, women were relegated to the private sphere. An apostle to the apostles, a female leader who received direct revelation and commanded the respect of the early community, was a massive problem for an institution that was increasingly trying to consolidate all spiritual authority into the hands of a male priesthood. You cannot easily tell women to be silent in the church if the most important message in the history of the church was delivered by a woman. You cannot easily mandate female submission if the text itself elevates a woman to the highest possible status of witness. The existence of Mary Magdalene, exactly as she was written in the Gospels, contradicted the direction the institution wanted to go. But you cannot just delete her from the text. Her name was too well known, her story was too embedded in the tradition. So if you cannot erase her name, what do? You change her identity. You neutralize the threat not by removing her, but by redefining her. And that brings us to the exact moment the mechanism was deployed. To understand how they did it, we have to travel to a very specific moment in time. We need to go to Rome in the late 6th century, because what happened there changed the course of history for women in the Western world. Let's go. The year is 591. The city of Rome is a shadow of its former glory. The Western Roman Empire has collapsed. The great aqueducts that once brought fresh water to millions are broken. The population has plummeted from over 1 million to a few tens of thousands. And worse, the city is being ravaged by famine, constant sieges by the Lombards, and the devastating bubonic plague. It is a time of absolute apocalyptic terror. People genuinely believe the end of the world is happening right in front of their eyes. The man trying to hold the city and the church together is Pope Gregory I, later known as Gregory the Great. Gregory is a brilliant administrator, a former prefect of Rome, born into a wealthy patrician family. He is a man obsessed with order, penance, and control. He is trying to build a unified narrative that will bring a terrified population to its knees in repentance, hoping to stave off the wrath of God. He needs powerful symbols of repentance to motivate the masses. And on a Thursday in September, in the year 591, Gregory delivers a sermon that will become known as Homily 33. He is preaching on the gospel texts, and he makes a rhetorical move that changes history forever. In the Gospels, there are 3 distinct, completely separate women. First, there is the unnamed sinful woman in Luke chapter 7, who enters a Pharisee's house, washes Jesus' feet with her tears, and dries them with her hair. The text never says she is a prostitute, just a sinner, but in the cultural context of the time, that was often interpreted as sexual sin. Second, there is Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who also anoints Jesus in a completely different scene in a different town. And third, There is Mary Magdalene, introduced in Luke chapter 8, from whom 7 demons were cast out. 3 different women, 3 different stories, 3 different identities. In Homily 33, Gregory I stands before his congregation and officially merges them all into one single person. He declares, quote, "She whom Luke calls the sinful woman, whom John calls Mary, we believe to be the Mary from whom 7 devils were ejected according to Mark." End quote. In one incredibly destructive sentence, Gregory conflates the wealthy patron and apostle to the apostles with the unnamed weeping sinner and the quiet sister of Lazarus. But he does not stop there. He has to deal with the 7 demons mentioned in Luke chapter 8. In the ancient world, demonic possession was a way to describe severe physical illness, mental anguish, or acute distress. It was a medical and spiritual diagnosis of suffering, not a moral indictment. But Gregory gives it a new definition entirely. He declares that the 7 demons represent the totality of all vices, specifically sexual vices. He says that she used her perfume not for pious reasons, but to perfume her flesh in forbidden acts. In that single sermon, Mary Magdalene, the wealthy financial patron, Mary Magdalene, the primary witness to the resurrection, Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, is completely obliterated from the official narrative. In her place, a new character is born. Mary Magdalene, the penitent whore, the fallen woman who was brought low by her sexual impurity and could only find redemption by weeping silently at the feet of men. And this was not just a theological mistake. It was an incredibly effective piece of institutional engineering. By merging these women, Gregory created the ultimate theological warning label. He provided the church with exactly what it needed, a model of female subservience. If even the greatest woman in the Gospels was actually a sexually ruined sinner who had to be humbled, then every woman was inherently suspect. Every woman was defined by her sexuality. Every woman needed the male priesthood to mediate her redemption. And the problem did not stop in the 6th century. It did not stay in that room in Rome, because when an institution with absolute power decides that a lie is useful, that lie becomes the law. And there is a part of this that most people have never realized. For the next 1,378 years, that single sermon became the official, unquestioned stance of the Western Church. It became the subject of thousands of magnificent Renaissance paintings, always depicting Mary Magdalene half-naked, weeping, looking upward in perpetual shame. It became the subject of countless sermons across Europe and eventually the Americas. It became the air that every Christian breathed. And this is where the mechanism functions exactly like a modern political smear campaign. If you repeat a lie loud enough and for long enough, it becomes the unquestioned truth. The lie of the penitent prostitute became the foundation for centuries of purity culture. It created a rigid binary system for women in the church. You were either the Virgin Mary, impossibly pure, silent, and unattainable, or you were Mary Magdalene, inherently sinful, sexually suspect, and constantly in need of deep repentance. There was absolutely no room for a woman who was just a leader. There was no room for a woman who had her own resources, her own voice, and her own direct connection to the divine. You were taught that your primary spiritual value was tied entirely to your sexual purity. You were taught that your body was a stumbling block for men, a dangerous temptation that had to be covered and controlled. You were taught that silence and submission were your highest, most holy virtues. And the entire time you were carrying that shame, the entire time you were twisting yourself into psychological knots trying to fit into that tiny, restrictive box, you were doing it based on a character that was literally invented by a man in the 6th century to consolidate institutional control. And here is something that seems impossible to believe. You might think that this is just ancient history. You might think this is just theological debate that has no real impact on the physical world. But it does. And it is right here that the story becomes incredibly dark and incredibly real. because theology always becomes policy. Ideas always have physical consequences on human bodies. And to prove that this is not just abstract theory, we have to look at what happened in Ireland from the 18th century all the way up until 1996. They were called the Magdalene Laundries. These were highly secretive institutions run by Catholic religious orders and supported by the Irish state, where an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 women were incarcerated against their will. Who were these women? They were unmarried mothers. They were victims of sexual abuse. They were girls who were deemed too flirtatious, too headstrong, or simply a financial burden on their impoverished families. They were labeled universally as fallen women. And inside these institutions, they were stripped of their names and their identities. They were given numbers. They were forced into unpaid, brutal, backbreaking labor, washing heavy laundry day in and day out, in complete, mandated silence. They were subjected to intense psychological and physical abuse. Many of them lived their entire lives inside those walls, died there, and were buried in unmarked mass graves. And look at the name of the institution, the Magdalene Laundries. The entire system of incarceration, forced labor, and systematic abuse was built directly, explicitly, on the false reputation of Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute. The name itself was the mechanism of control. If you label a woman after a fabricated penitent sinner, then locking her away and working her to the bone does not look like abuse. It looks like an act of profound mercy. It looks like you are saving her eternal soul. The lie that Pope Gregory invented in 591 became the literal prison walls for thousands of women in the 20th century. The last Magdalene laundry closed in 1996. That is not ancient history. That is exactly 30 years ago. The Irish state's McAleese report in 2013 finally confirmed the state's direct collusion in this horrific system. And this brings us to the most staggering part of the entire timeline. Because you have to ask yourself, if the texts never said she was a prostitute, and if historians and scholars have known this for centuries, what did the Vatican do about it? The answer is hiding in a place where almost no one ever looks. If an institution tells a lie that diminishes half the human race for 14 centuries, a lie that justifies the intense policing of women's bodies and the literal incarceration of thousands, you would expect the correction to be loud. You would expect a massive public apology. You would expect headlines around the world. You would expect a reckoning. Here is what actually happened. In 1969, during the sweeping liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church quietly updated its liturgical calendar. And in a tiny, obscure footnote, they officially separated the feast of Mary Magdalene from the feast of Mary of Bethany and the unnamed sinner of Luke chapter 7. They admitted quietly and implicitly that the conflation made by Pope Gregory in 591 was entirely incorrect. They formally acknowledged that the scriptural texts do not identify her as a prostitute. 1,378 years of a deeply damaging institutionalized smear campaign, corrected with a footnote. No press release, no front-page headlines, no public apology from the pulpit. Most Christians sitting in the pews in 1970, 1980, and even today never heard a single word about it. They just kept preaching the same old story about the repentant prostitute because the lie was too deeply embedded and, honestly, too incredibly useful for maintaining the hierarchy to let go of. It took another 47 years for the institution to take the next logical step. In 2016, Pope Francis issued a decree through the Congregation for Divine Worship called Apostolorum Apostola. In that decree, he officially elevated the liturgical remembrance of Mary Magdalene from a simple memorial to a full feast day, giving her equal standing with the 12 male apostles on the calendar. He formally recognized her by the exact title that early Christianity had given her before the smear campaign began, the Apostle to the Apostles. It is a beautiful gesture. But think about the math. Think about the arithmetic of the timeline. A man in power erased her true identity in one afternoon in 591. It took the institution until 1969 to quietly admit the mistake in a footnote, and until 2016 to formally restore her title. The correction took 1,425 years, and the math simply does not close. 14 centuries of teaching women to view their own bodies with intense suspicion. 14 centuries of using a fabricated story to mandate absolute female submission. 14 centuries of telling women that they could never hold true spiritual authority because the greatest woman in the Gospels was just a reformed whore. And in exchange, a footnote and a calendar update. The math does not add up by any conventional measure. And this is exactly where this stops being a story about a 1st century woman or a 6th century pope and becomes a story about you. If you are watching this and you grew up in that system, you know exactly what I am talking about. You remember the youth group lessons. You remember the purity rings and the modest clothing rules. You remember the overwhelming, suffocating pressure to remain entirely chaste, silent, and compliant. You remember being told that your worth was directly tied to your sexual purity, and that if you stumbled, if you made a mistake, you were damaged goods. A chewed-up piece of gum, a torn rose petal, just like Mary Magdalene before she was saved. You carried that guilt. You carried that shame. You internalized the toxic idea that you were spiritually inferior by design, that your voice mattered less than the men in the room, that your body was a problem to be constantly managed rather than a life to be deeply lived. But the guilt you were carrying was never yours. You were carrying the immense weight of a narrative that was engineered specifically to control you. You were carrying the shame of a woman who never actually existed, invented by a man who needed a convenient way to consolidate his own power during a crisis. The entire foundation of that purity culture, the entire theological justification for keeping you small, silent, and ashamed, was a complete historical fiction. And if they could successfully reframe the primary witness of the resurrection, the wealthy patron who funded the movement, the apostle to the apostles, into a symbol of female shame, and if the correction came 14 centuries later without a single headline, what else are we still preaching that someone else added? What else did you absorb as absolute, unquestionable divine truth that was actually just a mechanism of human control? What other pieces of your identity, your self-worth, and your view of God have been shaped by a 6th century political maneuver? And that is why I have left something crucial pinned down below in the first comment. The honest truth is that this channel does not make money anymore. YouTube demonetized it 2 months ago. But if you want to understand exactly how deep this goes, if you want to see the actual documents, the timelines, and the complete history of what was changed, what was burned, and what was hidden from you, I wrote the books. It is the Spinoza Forever Library. 5 volumes, 3 years of exhaustive research with every single source verifiable. It is not a donation, it is a complete research library, and the link is in the pinned comment. If this research has meant something to you, that is where you can find the rest of the story. If you made it this far, and if this content actually made sense to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It is incredibly important for the algorithm to understand that this kind of historical truth has real value for you, and it tells the platform that you want to see more videos just like this one, breaking down what actually happened and what was added later. The pact between you and the religious institutions you grew up in may have been completely broken. They may have handed you a narrative built on a 1,400-year-old lie. But there is a pact that no institution can break, because it does not depend on them. It is the pact between you and the historical reality. It is the pact between you and the truth of your own inherent worth. The people who understand that early have a massive advantage over the people who spend their whole lives trying to live up to a fabricated standard. You do not have to carry someone else's shame anymore. I will be stopping right here. But before I go, tell me down in the comments, have you ever felt that deep, unexplainable guilt about your own body or your place in the church, only to realize later that the rules were made up by men who just wanted to stay in charge? Write the word shame in the comments if you carried that weight for years. Let me know your story. To fully grasp the magnitude of what Gregory I did, you need to understand the world he was living in. The 6th century was not just another era, it was the collapse of everything the Western world knew as civilization. The plague of Justinian had swept through Europe, killing millions. It was a pandemic of such apocalyptic proportions that historians estimate it wiped out up to half the population of the known world. In Rome, the Tiber River had flooded, destroying the city's grain reserves. The Lombards were systematically dismantling the Italian peninsula. People literally believed the end of days had arrived. In a moment of absolute chaos, human beings do not look for nuance. They look for order. They look for a strong leader who can provide clear, absolute answers to why they are suffering. Gregory provided that order by demanding total, unquestioning penance. He believed that the suffering of the world was a direct result of human sin, and the only way to appease an angry God was through profound, public, and collective repentance. He needed powerful symbols to illustrate this theology. He needed characters from the sacred text that he could point to and say, "Look at her. She was a wretched sinner, completely consumed by vice, and she found mercy only by throwing herself at the feet of the Lord in total subjugation." Mary Magdalene was the most prominent woman in the Gospels. She was the perfect candidate, if only her story could be altered just enough to fit the narrative. And the alteration was seamless. Think about how the human brain works. When you merge 3 distinct stories into one, you create a composite character that is much more compelling than the originals. The unnamed woman weeping in Luke chapter 7 provides the emotional intensity and the implication of sexual sin. Mary of Bethany provides the quiet, submissive posture, sitting silently at the feet of Jesus. And Mary Magdalene provides the name, the prominence, and the crucial presence at the resurrection. By fusing them together, Gregory engineered a theological masterpiece, a woman who was famous, sexually stained, emotionally broken, and utterly submissive. It was the perfect blueprint for patriarchal control. And this blueprint was not just a theoretical concept, it was immediately put to work. Throughout the Middle Ages, the figure of the penitent Magdalene became the patron saint of fallen women. Convents and monasteries were established specifically to house prostitutes and women who had strayed outside the strict boundaries of sexual morality. These institutions were named after her. They were called Magdalene asylums long before they became the Magdalene laundries of Ireland. The mechanism of control was institutionalized across Europe. The message was clear. If you are a woman, your body is inherently dangerous. Your sexuality is a weapon that will destroy you and the men around you unless it is locked away, suppressed, and constantly monitored by the church. And the tragedy is that this control mechanism was applied even to women who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The definition of a fallen woman expanded to include anyone who did not conform to the rigid expectations of the patriarchal system. A woman who spoke her mind too loudly was considered dangerous. A woman who sought independence was considered suspect. A woman who was the victim of sexual assault was often blamed for the crime and locked away to protect the reputation of the men involved. The shadow of the penitent prostitute fell over every single woman in the Western world, dictating what she could wear, how she could speak, and what she was allowed to desire. The psychological toll of this 1400-year smear campaign is incalculable. We are talking about generations of women who lived and died believing that they were fundamentally flawed in the eyes of the divine. We are talking about millions of lives constrained by a fear of eternal damnation, a fear that was artificially constructed to keep them compliant. The purity culture of the 20th and 21st centuries is just the latest iteration of this ancient control mechanism. It uses different words, different youth groups, and different purity rings, but the underlying theology is exactly the same. You are a problem to be solved, and your submission is the only acceptable solution. And when you finally realize that the entire foundation of this culture is a historical fiction, a lie invented by a pope in the 6th century, the anger you feel is completely justified. You have a right to be furious. You have a right to mourn the years you spent trying to fit into a mold that was designed to break you. You have a right to look at the institution that perpetuated this lie for 14 centuries and demand accountability. Because a quiet footnote in a liturgical calendar is not accountability. It is an evasion. It is a desperate attempt to correct the historical record without admitting the devastating human cost of the error. But the good news is that you do not need the institution to validate your worth. You do not need a papal decree to tell you that you are not damaged goods. The truth has been sitting there in the canonical texts the entire time. Mary Magdalene was never a prostitute. She was a patron, a leader, and the apostle to the apostles. She was a woman of immense courage and authority who stood by her convictions when the men around her fled in terror. Her true story is not a story of sexual shame and silent submission. It is a story of independence, resilience, and profound spiritual power. And that is a story you can build a life on. The system tried to erase her, but they failed. They tried to silence her, but the truth survived in the very texts they claimed to protect. And now that you know the truth, the mechanism of control loses its power. The prison walls constructed by a 6th century sermon begin to crumble. You are free to step out of the shadow of the penitent prostitute and reclaim your own narrative. You are free to understand that your body is not a battleground, your voice is not a threat, and your worth is not contingent on your submission. You are free to be exactly who you are, without apology and without shame. And the next time someone tries to use religion to make you feel small, you can look them in the eye and know with absolute certainty that they are speaking for an institution, not for the divine. They are reciting a script written by men who needed to maintain their own power. They are handing you a burden that you simply do not have to carry anymore. You can hand it back, you can walk away, and you can finally start to heal. This is the power of historical truth. It does not just correct the record, it liberates the mind. It breaks the chains of inherited guilt and allows you to see yourself with clarity and compassion. The story of Mary Magdalene is not just a theological debate. It is a mirror reflecting the long, arduous struggle for female autonomy. And by understanding exactly how her identity was stolen, you take the first step toward reclaiming your own.